Okay. Hello, everybody. A hot day. A hot day. I thought it was the last hot day. And Meredith said, Nancy, it's not the last hot day. So welcome to Writers Read. And welcome to our two readers, Irwin Sarason and Ladson Hinton. We're so looking forward to what they're going to say and read today. And Irwin, you have read before. You have read some, what? Excuse me? Thank you. I just moved right along, Linda. The reason I skipped the poem, Linda, is that today they have to say it. I'm not going to say the line and then So here we go, everybody. Right, until you get it right. Then read aloud. You'll draw a crowd and bring us great delight. Linda, thank goodness you're here, dear heart. I was cruising right along with Irwin here. Irwin, I was going to say then that you have read before, and you have read papers from your field, and you have read some wonderful writing about your family experiences. And today we're going to hear some more. And I'm so glad you've agreed to come to read. But I have to tell one story about Irwin. 3 days ago, we met briefly before Writers Read, and I got up from the library table and went over to the collection on the windowsill looking for Irwin's book. Irwin's book was not there. And Irwin said, "Oh, good, somebody's reading it." So, Irwin, it shall return. The name of his book is Personality, an Objective Approach. And Irwin, before we go on to your reading today, I want you to say how many years you've been connected to the University of Washington.
64 years.
Round of applause. 64 years attached to the university.
And on that occasion, I was presented with a plaque signed by Anna Marie Causset, but also given to me by Anna Marie Causset. And the thing that kind of hit me was I had been the chair of the psychology department when Anna Marie was hired as an assistant professor coming from the University of Delaware.
Not on? Yes. I was telling Irwin that he could probably have an evening program because his stories just are so rich and wonderful. But right now, let's hear what you're going to read today.
Well, before I read, I want to tell you that I might have made a terrible mistake about a half hour ago because I was thinking about what was going to happen now, and the thought occurred to me, maybe what I should do is present my conclusion first. And I convinced myself that I should do it. So I'm going to give you the conclusion of the talk, and then I'm going to give you the rest of the stuff. But the conclusion is, write it down, that what I'm going to be talking about is recollections of things related to my family that I have written down. I also have a list, which I will tell you about if there's time at the end, of things related to my family that I have not written down and I should get to work on very soon. But I think there's probably nothing more important that anybody can do but write down, and not in a necessarily fancy way either, but things that are important to you. And I'll just give one example of why it's important to write things down. There was a restaurant on the corner of 19th and Aloha. to which, at a certain point, and when our kids were young, we went about once a week. My wife was the president of the Seattle League of Women Voters, and she was spending about 60 hours a week there, and sometimes she didn't feel like making dinner. And we went to this restaurant, which is right across the street from St. Joseph's Church on 19th and Aloha. And it was a big deal because you decided what you wanted, you went up and told them what you wanted, and then they brought it to the table. And every time we told the kids that we were going to go there, they were absolutely thrilled. Well, about a month ago, a friend of mine took me to a Thai restaurant half block away, and I immediately saw, quote, our restaurant, and it turned out it's now a Macrina. And I cannot remember the name of that restaurant. And which hostess? Surrogate. Oh, you're right. Well, I'm very glad I brought that up, because I've been worrying about that now for a couple of weeks. I'll have to come to you with some more of my problems. Anyway, so you now have heard the conclusion of the talk, and let me tell you what the talk is. I'm going to read to you a couple of pages of something that I wrote about my father, and then then about 6 years ago, I wrote a kind of a little autobiography, 55 pages, single-spaced. And when my wife died 6 years ago, I realized that she had never written anything about her life. And so I then wrote, quote, an autobiography for her of things that I remember that I thought were important. And about 3 or 4 Father's Days ago, one of my daughters gave me 3 pieces of paper which contained 12 paragraphs on 12 topics. And I mention that because I think it's a good example of how you don't need things that are fancy. You don't need anything that's bound. But if you can do anything that will help remember things like the surrogate hostess, it's great. So I'd like to start by reading to you something that I wrote about my father. And the reason I'm reading it is, in recent years, I've kind of rediscovered my father. I never had enough sense to ask him the kinds of questions that I should have asked him, what his life was like. And I think I had no interest in it because I didn't know I should be interested in it. And so this is just something that I've written about him. His name was Max. My father was a little guy, maybe 5'3", with a lot of energy. He loved walking. For miles on Sundays, he would have a nap after he had taken a huge walk. He had a routine that fully occupied his life. He got up at 5:30 in the morning, put on his tallis, which is a prayer shawl, and his tefillin, which are leather straps that you're supposed to put on, Jews put on when they say certain kinds of prayers. And he would prepare his breakfast, which was usually rye bread or pumpernickel. Cheese, coffee played important roles. He usually had to be at work at 8 o'clock and got home at about 6:30 in the evening. After dinner, he listened to the news on the radio, especially commentators including Boke Carter, Gabriel Heater, and H.V. Kaltenborn, which some of you might know about. He was an enthusiastic newspaper reader. On the way home, he picked up on buses and trains several papers, including the Newark Evening News, the Newark Star Ledger, the New York Times, the New York Journal American, the New York Daily News, and the New York Herald Tribune. And so we had tons of paper every day, none of which he ever paid anything for, because he just picked them up on the way. And he believed that the Journal American, which was a Hearst paper, and the Daily News were serious. There was something seriously wrong with those papers. And he went to bed at 9:30 or 10 o'clock in order to be ready for the activities that would follow on the next day. Saturday, he had a different program that started an hour later than on weekdays, but with pretty much the same breakfast that might be expanded with fancier foods. He liked to go to a fish market and buy fish for my mother to cook, and he would get sometimes if he could get a bargain of 15 pounds of whitefish, he would buy it, not stopping to think that maybe he ought to check with Annie, my mother, to find out if she could do anything with 15 pounds of whitefish. After breakfast, he would go to the synagogue, which was down the street from where we lived. And after lunch, he would take a long walk, get his big nap. And when I was beginning at around ages 4 or 5, he would take me to Weequahic Park, which is a wonderful park in Newark, New Jersey, which was designed by the Olmsted firm. The people who had done Central Park also did Weequahic Park. And actually, we had two parks fairly near where we lived. One was Weequahic Park, and the other was Branchbrook Park. When we went to Weequahic Park on Saturday afternoon, they had harness races there. They had a harness racetrack, and it was all free. You didn't have to pay anything. And so he would take me there, and we would watch the races. And the track was well maintained. The horses were intriguing. It was all exciting. And then on the way back, we often stopped for a little shopping on Bergen Street in Newark, which was one of the big shopping streets. And our major stop usually was a place called Tabachnik's, which had all kinds of herrings, pickles, and other kinds of fish that he loved. And the smell of the place was absolutely wonderful also. But he liked bargains. He didn't have much money. He liked bargains, and he would look for ways of getting things cheap, like the ton of whitefish he would get. If he went to a place that had it and it was cheap enough, he would buy it. And so he would take me to Debauchik's after we had been to Weequahic Park. Shopping was a very important part of his life. And the bargaining was a very important part of his life. To see him bite into a Macintosh apple in October was a real experience. He loved apples. He would sometimes come home with 15 pounds of apples, and so we had lots of applesauce in October. He might come home with 8 bunches of beets, enough to make borscht for several dinners. And he also liked to buy carrots, sometimes 10, 12 pounds. Or occasionally he would come back with a 25-pound pack of potatoes. As a child, I was often embarrassed by my father's accented English. What I couldn't appreciate then was the resourcefulness in him that I see now. Before one Jewish holiday, he was concerned about not having enough money to buy the fish that my mother needed to make gefilte fish for the holiday. To get what he needed, he hitched a ride from Newark to the Holland Tunnel, then hitched another ride from the Holland Tunnel to the Fulton Fish Market in Brooklyn, and there he bought 20 pounds of whitefish. and yellow pike also. And he hitched a ride back to the Holland Tunnel, and then purely by accident, my cousin Sophie happened to be driving from New York to Newark, and there she saw Uncle Max standing there. So he smelled up her car very nicely when she drove him home with the package. And Max was busy all the time, except when he napped on the weekend. When he had a job, he pursued opportunities to work overtime in order to increase his paycheck. He had a very clear perspective of the things that needed to be done. For example, making his own horseradish, which was a very big thing. And once he was making the horseradish in the room that I use, and when you make horseradish, you've got to scrape it, and he was using a big wooden bowl, and the whole thing just fell down from the second floor. And that was one of the big tragedies that occurred then. The question that I ask now, and should have asked earlier, was, who is this man that I knew in the 1930s and 1940s? Although at the time, and for many years afterwards, I had absolutely no interest in that question. By the late 30s and early 40s, I began to have quite a bit of curiosity. And now, many years later, I find myself trying to piece together the bits of information that I have, and I wish I had more. One of the big regrets in my life is that I wish I knew him better and shown him that when he was alive. I think he was born in 1889, but I'm not certain about that. He was born in Vilna, Lithuania, came to this country when he was 18. A major reason was the likelihood of conscription into the military, usually for a term of 20 to 24 years. This was when the Russian influence was present. He came to North America with the help of an agent who handled all the travel arrangements and spent some time in England on the way. He came to Canada before coming to New York. Apparently his mother lived in Canada, having come there several years before he did. Why did she come? Why did she come before he did? I have absolutely no idea. In terms of his own life, the Depression changed everything. He lost his job. There were long periods, there was 1 year period when he was unemployed. And for a time he worked at a temporary job in Jersey City, and he received unemployment compensation checks of $17 a week for a long period of time. And I remember very clearly those $17 checks, because as soon as the $17 check arrived, my mother sent me to the store to buy some stuff that we could eat for dinner. So I mean, it was a big deal. When I would visit him in the synagogue during the high holy days, I was always impressed, but never really did anything about it. I was always impressed by observing him recite the entire service from memory. He came to the service with a book about that thick, and about every 15 or 20 minutes, while he was saying whatever it is that he was saying, he would occasionally turn the page, but he would never look at the page. And it didn't dawn on me until several years later that he knew the entire book by heart. He didn't need the book. He brought it in case maybe he made a mistake or maybe he would forget something. He belonged to only one organization. It was a kind of a lodge, and I think I got the name right. I think the name of it is the Reim Ahuven KUV, whatever KUV refers to, I don't know. And he went to their meetings once a month. And he had a whole bunch of buddies that he dealt with when he went to those meetings. And the organization had only one activity, and that was to lend interest-free money, to give interest-free loans to people who needed money. And a couple of times he borrowed money from them. And he went to one meeting and came back and told us one of the things that had happened at the meeting. But he was laughing so hard that he had trouble getting it out. And I find that kind of interesting, because if there is a laughter gene, I have the same gene. About 2 or 3 times a year, something will strike me funny, and it'll go on for a minute and a half, and I'll be unable to stop. And what he told us about that meeting was he was talking to his buddies, and one of them said to him, "Max, how come you, a cutter of infants' wear, have 2 sons with PhDs?" And my father thought for a moment, and then he said, "It skips a generation." and he could barely get that out when he was talking to his buddies, but he could also barely get it out when he was telling us about what had happened at the meeting. There's more, but I'm not going to read it. You just have to do without. And when my wife died, I realized that she had never written anything about her life. And so about 3 or 4 years ago, I wrote a, quote, autobiography of her. And it's not an autobiography. It's recollections that I have of things that happened in her life. But I've written it almost as if it were written by her, which might not have been a good thing. And so I'm just going to tell you about a couple of the scenes that took place. When my wife and I got married, when Barbara and I got married, both sets of parents were very upset. Her parents were upset because I was Jewish, and my parents were upset because she wasn't Jewish. And there was great discomfort. But the parents came around, and we were married in the living room of Barbara's parents' house. And the day before the wedding, we were visited by the minister who would perform the service. And he was the minister of the church to which Barbara's parents went, the Evangelical United Brethren Church of Indianapolis. So it was a mouthful, and it was a big deal. And there were about 25 friends and members of the family who came to the wedding. And the day before, when Mr. Whistler visited us, he mentioned that he'd like to have the couple to be married kneel during part of the ceremony. And Barbara, who was capable of being assertive but didn't like it, and she was as tactful a person as possible, as soon as Mr. Whistler said that, she said to him, "My husband-to-be is Jewish, and I want the service to be as ecumenical as possible." And that's what Mr. Whistler did. I mean, it worked out very, very nicely. But I think the incident is important because she did something that she really didn't want to have to do, but she did it. And she yes. And I could tell stories about that, but I won't. But she was not an extrovert, but she was very good at relating to people. I'm bothered sometimes when we talk about introversion and extroversion, as if each was some kind of a unitary thing, which is not the case. She had probably fewer close relationships than many people, but they were very, very good and very deep relationships. And this showed itself in many ways and with many people. After Barbara retired, Barbara had a PhD, and after we had when we had our first child, we both agreed that the most important thing for us would be for her to stay home with the kids, which she did for 12 years. And only after about the 8th or 9th year did she become involved in the league, which was very important to her. And then after this long period of time of not having kept up with the literature, she came back on the faculty of the University of Washington. And there are a number of things in here which I'm not going to read to you about the students that she influenced. And another thing that I'm not going to tell you about or read to you, but I'll just mention it, was she was very interested in interpersonal relationships. And she is a co-founder of 2 international organizations for holding conferences. And so I've got a whole bunch of things upstairs about the meetings that she had arranged. But her ability to relate to people, it still comes up now. It showed itself in many ways and with many people. After Barbara retired, the South Asian woman who cleaned the 2nd floor of Guthrie Hall, where we worked, stopped me and asked me to say hello to my wife. And this was a couple of years after Barbara had already retired, so they knew each other. On other occasions, when we shopped at the Pike Place Market, we had a routine that every Saturday morning we would go down to the Pike Place Market, go to the crumpet shop, have crumpets and coffee. And by the way, the crumpet shop in Seattle at the Pike Place Market is one of only 3 in the United States, the places that call themselves the crumpet shop. And the man, and one of the markets that we went to was a place called Socio's, which some of you may know about. And the man who runs Socio, for years after Barbara had died, would stop me and ask me or tell me a story about some interaction that he had had with her. I want to go on because I want to say everything I have to say, and I don't want to steal Ladson's time. Do I have time for?
I think not. When Irwin walked in today, I said, "You need a whole evening." I said, "I Googled you again. I confess, when I Google people, I confess." And I told...
Let me just read one paragraph.
Okay.
And I'm not going to read anything else from this. But on this Father's Day a few years ago, my daughter gave me these individual paragraphs about things that she remembered. One paragraph is entitled Aquatina Time. One of the things, this is my daughter talking, one of the things I remember from when we lived at 13028 42nd Avenue Northeast is the Aquatina ritual. Jane, my other daughter, and I would make aquatina by mixing together various substances we found in the bathroom. Triddle's hand lotion, baby magic, and other things were thrown in. And every night when I would come home from work, I would be asked to please sit down on the toilet seat, and I would get my aquatina treatment. And they would anoint me with this compound that they had made. And I don't think it ever occurred to them to wonder why it was that after Daddy had his aquatina treatment, he would always take a shower. That just didn't mean anything. And
Oh, Irwin, this,
Anyway, I've gone over, and I'm going to leave. I want to leave time
no,
for.
this is always a rich time, and you've got to promise us to come back at some future date, because we'd love to hear more.
And one of the things you're not going to hear about is a long list of things that I've now been thinking about and have not written anything about, but at least now I know the surrogate hostess, and I'll make use of that.
Thank you, Irwin. This was a treat, very much so. Ladson Hinton, welcome very much. Ladson and I, with Irwin, did meet 3 days ago to kind of get things worked out here. And I went online and I printed out what I thought was pretty pivotal information about Ladson. And I put it on the table and passed it to Ladson for him to check it out. He looked at me and he said, "Nancy, this is my son." Oh, you were so gentle about my big mistake. I have returned with another bio, but some of you might have heard his son last Monday, who was here for the World Concerns program, and his son spoke on Cambodia at that point, and it is on the video. Is it? I think it is, so we can all see it, because I missed it too. So, Ladson, welcome. We're very glad to have you here. I'm just going to read a little bit, Ladson. Ladson Hinton, MD, is a psychoanalyst who practices and teaches in Seattle, Washington. He is a graduate of the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco and a founding member of the New School for Analytical Psychology in Seattle. So this is a bit about Ladson, and we're going to hear more. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I think it's very coincidental. My paper will be different than what we just heard, but I think in some deeper spirit, they'll be very similar. So I'm looking forward to kind of feel the resonances and so forth, because the deeper currents of this paper, many of them come from my own marriage and the death of my wife 7 years ago. So my glasses are bothering me a little bit, so I'm trying to get these adjusted. My first conscious, so a lot of the paper what I'm going to write about is death. And the reason I'm writing about death is, there are many reasons, was that about 1.5 years ago I got a special request to write a long chapter on death for a book coming out. I think it's September 1st with Chiron Publications in Switzerland. And so first I was hesitant, but then I found this, it came out of me faster than almost any paper I'd written, at least for some number of years. I wrote the first draft out, I think, and for me it was 9,000 words in 2 weeks. So for me, that's fast writing. But the nuances, many things are implications and realities of family life going back in history, but also much closer to the present, the living present of people and their world. So I thought there's a lot of nice coincidence. It may not be as highly personal as what we just heard, but in a way it is as highly personal, and I think will resonate in a deep way. My first conscious memory of death is viewing the dead body of my great-grandfather. Augustus Papa Reichert had died at age 88, of old age, when I was 8 years old. His parents were German immigrants from Saxony and had settled in Fort Smith, Arkansas in the mid-19th century. Papa's father was a shoemaker, and Papa had become a master plumber at a time when indoor plumbing was all the rage. He'd actually become quite wealthy in the local scene. One day I surveyed the open coffin across the dining room of my great-grandfather. I was viewing the coffin, a little guy. My younger female cousins were playing on the floor near it. I felt frozen. I saw some older adults come by and kiss Papa on the forehead. That seemed to be the expected behavior, but I felt totally incapable of even approaching the casket, much less kissing him. Now I realize that actually I hadn't kissed him very much before, I don't think. Anyhow, I've always been kind of frightened of him. My usual escape from the family gatherings at that old house had been to go to a large glass front bookcase in the living room and look through the books. That was my escape. That's what I did that day, and that's in a way what I've done my whole life, in a sense, I guess. It was a refuge, and I could let my shame subside at not kissing his his forehead. I'm going to hopscotch through periods of time and place, so this won't be linear. So I skipped now to the time when World War II ended in 1945. I was 11. My Uncle Ken, who was married to my favorite aunt, returned home from service in the U.S. Army Medical Corps. He was a strong early influence on me, a gregarious masculine presence in contrast to my more reticent father. After his return, I didn't see much of him. His return from the war, I heard he was in a strange state, maybe shell-shocked. A few weeks later, my aunt asked me to stop by. I hiked to their home, and we sat down in their living room, and he offered to show me some photos. Ken was an excellent amateur photographer and had managed to get film to document his experiences. What struck me most were photos of the concentration camps his units had liberated. There were stacks of skeletal bodies, as well as tattered figures in ragged striped clothes. "Laddie," he told me, that's what Hitler did to the Jews. He didn't say much of anything else. That day affected me profoundly. Almost this moment brings tears to me, actually. The world, I realize, contains death makers who might kill anyone for no reason at all. When I was a junior in college, I had a powerful inner experience with death that dramatically changed the course of my life. I was feeling aimless and uncertain about the future. I had considered becoming a physician. However, I had never much liked the sciences, preferring literature and history. I was barely 20, and a serious relationship with an older woman, an art teacher who was 23, had very dramatically broken up. A couple of days later, I was alone during the late afternoon in my little apartment reading the Brothers Karamazov. I fell asleep and had a dream vision of death that changed the course of my life. In the dream, I was lying in the gutter of a golden road in a deep forest, clearly dying. A deep male voice, absolute and powerful, proclaimed, "You will go to medical school." I awakened in a panic. It was so absolute and absolutely strange to me at that time. The dream was simple in structure, but the affective punch was powerful and pervaded my being. Warned of death along the road of life, it's difficult to convey in writing the absolute certainty of that voice that spoke when I was alone and bereft in my little apartment. I was terrified. The message was simple, and I had no doubt that the choice was life or death. It felt like an absolute commandment and radically changed the course of my life. I soon told my parents that I was changing my major, a decision they supported. I didn't share my experience, however, with anyone until 4 years later when I told the story to my wife-to-be. Her understanding was part of the early basic cement for our 60 years of marriage. We sometimes had differences over the years, but whatever the turbulence, a level of deeper trust and bonding was always there. My dream vision experience with death helped ground me. It wasn't something way off in the stratosphere or fussy. It didn't make me feel special. If anything, it made me feel fearing I wasn't in some way special in terms of being called to a profession. It provided discipline and fostered a supply of energy and focus that persists to this day. I feel it right now as our right. The encounter with death opened many authentic gateways to life and enabled me to be who I am. Death is a demanding teacher. 4 years later, in 1961, I married the love of my life and graduated from Washington University Medical School in St. Louis. At that time, the U.S. military was expanding in size due to Cold War tensions, and I was drafted into the Army Medical Corps the next year during my internal medicine internship at Georgetown University Hospital. I was offered the option of entering the Army in 1962 as a general medical officer, or entering 3 years later after both the internship and 3-year residency in psychiatry at Stanford University Hospital, and I chose the latter. My medical internship itself was demanding, scary, and deeply gratifying. We had 2 small children at the time, and I was on call every other night at the hospital for a full year, except for a 2-week vacation. My wife was extraordinarily hardworking and loving, and I remain eternally grateful to her for that. It was a time of deep initiation for her as well as for me. Georgetown Hospital was a large acute care hospital sharing responsibilities for medical emergencies with District of Columbia General Hospital. The maelstrom of emergency care and recovery or death was intense. Among the many responsibilities, the core role was to break the news of deaths to families and to request permission for an autopsy, which was kind of a pretty difficult mission. Often the interns were the ones who pronounced the person dead. I discovered it is often difficult to know when someone is dead. Perhaps I was now a more precise measure. I know that most of the interns mention nightmares of having made an error and corpses arising ghoulishly from their coffins. It was an unforgettable initiation into both the deep grief of families and rituals of death that go back to the origins of human culture. At the graduation banquet at the end of the year at Georgetown, I received a verbal recognition for having had the least deaths on my services. As I recall, the number was 26. After the year at Georgetown, I crossed the country with my young family to begin 3 years of psychiatric training at Stanford University in Palo Alto. New and exciting things filled the air at Stanford, as well as the whole Bay Area. I quickly caught the scent of the spirit that was beginning to emerge. At Stanford, David Hamburg had just begun his chair of psychiatry and insisted psychiatry residents be designated fellows of the university to avoid a parochialism of just being a psychiatrist. Irv Yalom, the existentialist, became one of my supervisors, and William Dement, the co-discovery of REM sleep, was also an active teacher. During the last year of my residency, we were encouraged to undertake special studies in some area that had stimulated us during training. I chose a year-long period of studies with Kurt Reinhardt, a professor emeritus of history at Stanford. He was born and educated in Germany and was the author of The Existentialist Revolt, as well as a monumental study of German history, still being used. Reinhardt had been at the University of Freiburg as a young student and attended Martin Heidegger's lectures. It was a transformative experience to study with this revered teacher and philosopher. Life as being towards death was at the center of my studies for sure. Is temporality the basic being of the human? This reversed the ancient tradition that privileged eternal iterations of Platonic ideas that were atemporal, beyond time, deathless. In contrast, under the Heideggerian aegis of being towards death, temporality is our fundamental reality, and death is the most profound manifestation of our boundedness by temporality. We know that we are creatures who die. Temporality is our core being, our core humanity. After finishing my residency, at least 2 years of military service were required. The military allowed doctors to state their preferred geographical area for service, and my wife and I chose Europe. Especially with the example of my uncle, I saw military service as part of my duty as a citizen and had no resentment about being drafted. To my mind, at that time, the Soviet Union was an aggressive threat to Western culture, and communism was an ideology that had gone terribly wrong and was a threat to world freedom. The German civilians, as we arrived there and began to get acquainted, largely welcomed the Americans, even as they continued rebuilding their bombed-out cities. Reconstruction after all the bombings was still taking place, even in the 15 years after the war. There was a strong fear of the Russians and often a sense of shame about the terrible crimes by Nazi leaders. My unit, the 24th Infantry Division, had outpatient clinics in Munich and Augsburg. As captain and physician, I was the chief psychiatric medical officer for all military personnel and their families in southwest Germany. There was probably at least 100,000 or maybe more at that time. In addition, I discovered I was responsible for a small military prison in Dachau, not far from Munich. After an hour or so drive through the Munich suburbs with a friend who was chauffeuring to show me around, the prison came into view. I caught sight of the famous sign typical of all the camps, an immensely ironic and iconic iron sign over the gate stating, Arbeit macht frei, work makes free. It was notorious and it was a shock. We approached the jail building and showed our IDs. We went through the gate and I shuddered as it clanged shut behind me. There was much to think about when I made my bi-weekly visits to Dachau. I soon realized that my main job would be to process people out of the Army, and only very limited psychotherapy would be possible. That is, part of the prison was used as a jail for American soldiers who'd done wrong at various levels. I don't know if that's clear. It was an adjacent part of the camp that had been used previously for high political prisoners, politicians, so forth, that the Nazis had picked up. A substantial part of the main concentration camp had been preserved as a museum and memorial. The prison where I consulted was a smaller, separate entity, as I said. And it so happened a couple my wife and I had known at Stanford were in Europe and stopped in Munich to visit us. He was Jewish and eager to visit the museum at the Dachau camp. It was a shocking experience. There were photos of prisoners being frozen as experiments to test for treatments to be used, quote, for the benefit of the troops in cold climates. I recall another in which the top of the skull of a prisoner was sawed off to expose the brain. As we left the camp with our friends, I felt a terrible pain in my right ankle. I could hardly walk. It was red and swollen and exquisitely painful. We drove to the U.S. military hospital in Munich, and I was hospitalized for tests. It turned out to be acute gout, a very treatable but extremely painful condition. I had often thought of the wounded state of the world, especially the Western world after Nazism and the Holocaust. This was my wound, too, for sure. Indeed, a deep collective wound. Being within those remnants, the gigantic human horror had exceeded my capacity to maintain my equilibrium at various levels. Now the conclusion, I will move on to discuss a later experience closer to home if we have time. My wife Darlene died in 2017 from several chronic conditions. The terminal stage lasted about 10 days, and she died a week short of our 60th anniversary. Maintaining a mere semblance of life when there was no hope seemed degrading to her and to us. We had once had long discussions about such a heart-rending subject with our close friend Donald Sadner, who chose not to be medicalized at the end of his own life. Hospice care is excellent in Seattle, of course. Excuse me. And our three sons had time to come from out of town to say their goodbyes. My own goodbye was wrenching. We had our final kiss at the very last second of her life. She and I had rarely been apart more than a day during our 60 years of marriage. Of course, there were plenty of ups and downs. They were very different temperaments, but we always were together. Very much in sync as parents, 2 to 3 sons. Our love was deep and real. After everyone had left town following her memorial, I felt like a ghost myself. I wondered how I could go on. Then I had a gut-wrenching, unforgettable dream set in Mendocino, California, a small town, maybe some of you know it, that she and I used to love to visit. We had just finished lunch at a small restaurant in the dream. As we left, I paused to give some menu advice to a young couple there. She wandered away as we talked. I turned to find her. There was a small street fair outside, and I thought that she might be stopping to look at the arts and crafts. Then I saw that she was walking rapidly away on the other side of the crowd. I went to catch up to her and called out, but she didn't seem to hear. It felt like she was in a sort of a spell. She reached a set of adobe buildings and disappeared into one. However, before I could enter myself, I heard a loud, horrible sound like grinding, clanging mechanical gears. I awakened in shock with the words, "The infernal machine," emblazoned like a headline in my mind. The dream filled me with horror. Was death eating up my gentle, beautiful, kind wife? The grinding, chattering gears felt inexorable, a horrible inevitability. Not just death, but any life in a certain kind of essential way. I was intermittently disoriented for days. However, as my mind settled down somewhat in the coming weeks, I slowly realized that she had in fact left me in a peaceful way with a wonderful kiss. After some days, I came to more fully realize, probably and perhaps, that it was my dream. The experience was about me, it wasn't her experience of death. Infernal Machine felt very vaguely familiar to me and was immensely provocative, but I had no conscious memory of what it meant or where it came from. The voice still echoes in my mind, the Infernal Machine, along with the gruesome sound of the grinding, merciless gears of inevitability. Even now I can feel it like a sucking quicksand that could engulf me. The term Infernal Machine actually has many connections with warfare. There was an attempt on Napoleon's life using a hidden bomb, which he later referred to as an infernal machine. Hidden landmines and booby traps, which may threaten every step a soldier takes, are often referred to as infernal machines, the death that can occur at any time. My core dream and vision also raises the question of freedom versus unfreedom. The beginning scene of the dream included a young couple setting out to explore a new place. In contrast, the uncanny mechanical sounds came across like an inexorable force that often seems to live our lives and do its will despite our best intentions. How much freedom do we ultimately have? The final monstrosity that appeared in my dream was death. Our love could not defeat it. That, it seems to me, is our human fate. We do what we can. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing this, reading and writing and your heart with us. Thank you. It's been a rich afternoon, both of you. Thank you, Irwin and Ladson. And we hope you come back, both of you, again and again. You have stories, more stories to tell. The tip of the iceberg, I want to just mention that I spent some time Googling Irwin and Ladson and the papers and books. Look at the titles. I mean, I just wanted to, I spent a half an hour just reading the titles, not the papers, but do that. I urge you all to do that, because these are amazing people and have gifts to give us still. Thank you, Ladson. Thank you, Irwin.
Thank you for kind. Thank you.